So my thought for today, I read through as many of the comments in response to my scenario as were available when I was looking at them last night. And I thought, this is actually something we should discuss. It's something you've thought about now by having put up the discussion points. I think there was a little bit more than average back and forth between various of you. And so I thought we might actually begin with, first of all, a statistic that you will have seen from the American Academy of Arts and Science Democracy Report, which you've read. It's a stunning statistic. Fewer than 1/3 of millennials consider it essential to live in a democracy. That was a poll done probably 10 years ago. What is stunning about that is that these are young people. Millennials, who are millennials, by the way? What cohort does that refer to? Do you know? Yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
Like late 20, early to mid 30s.
Mm-hmm. So kind of a little bit older than the average age of this group, but kind of in the same generation. Fewer than 1/3 of people in their 20s into their 30s consider it essential to live in a democracy. That's a pretty striking statistic, a striking result of American young people living in a liberal democracy, a constitutional democracy. And therefore, I want to turn the discussion to you. Maybe I should have given you a little warning to say that not only did I ask you to comment on this discussion topic, but that I would like for you to have some conversation in class today. Maybe it would be helpful if I reread the prompt. Why don't I do that? Go back to the prompt and let's see. I'm scanning through here we go. Okay, discussion topic. So the prompt was this: how bad would it be if the United States were transformed into a more authoritarian political system? How would that affect your life, individually, personally, or the groups that you are associated with? What if the transformation were legal and democratic? Maybe something like this: prior to the 2032 presidential election, 12 years from now, both houses of Congress have passed a constitutional amendment giving the president the power by executive order to supersede constitutional provisions and federal laws, quote, when he or she judges that such action is needed for the common good. Each political party is expected to bring forward a candidate for president in 2032 who can win a majority of voters. That's what the parties expect. The implication of the constitutional amendment is that this election may be election for life, because the president who is elected in 2032 would have the power to cancel future elections, to cancel term limits on election, to suspend the independent press in order to have a free hand in, quote, taking the steps government needs to take in order to establish the common good. In other words, lots and lots and lots, in fact, unlimited executive power. How bad would that be if you could have a reasonable level of confidence that the candidate that you like best is likely to be elected? How bad would it be if you were uncertain which kind of candidate or which candidate is likely to win? So that's the prompt. And I think all of you had interesting comments, thoughtful comments, reflective comments to contribute on that prompt. So I'd like to have some conversation about that. Anybody who would like to start? Feel free to go back to your own, if you kind of like to be refreshed, you too can go back to the written record and see what you actually wrote, but I bet your thoughts are still pretty fresh. Yeah, Blake, good.
So I wrote about how if the U.S. was transformed into an authoritarian government, it would be disastrous for our liberal democratic ideals, where no matter, even if your preferred candidate was elected or not, it sets a very dangerous precedent for years and years to come. And I think after you've kind of steered away from that, from liberal democracy, it makes it so much harder to be able to even go back to that. And I also added too that even if the person who you thought was the best choice for that position was elected, that still doesn't mean that that person is good for the majority. So for all Americans, others could be disenfranchised, as where you may not see it yourself. And I wrote that if some Americans lose their freedoms as a result of that, then really all Americans could lose their freedoms.
Excellent. Any thoughts to Blake, or a new thought you'd like to put on the table? So Blake referred to two things. One, even if your preferred candidate wins, the precedent and the damage to our constitutional protections of freedom and the rights of minorities and so forth, those rights are harmed permanently. You made a very interesting point, Blake, that it's a little bit like making an omelet. Once you've cracked the egg, you can't put the egg back into the shell. The egg has been scrambled, and constitutional protections of our rights are easier to interfere with than they are to repair. So those are both interesting points. There's probably more to say even about that scenario. Anybody want to contribute on the topic? You have a favored candidate, you feel pretty confident in that person, and yet you would not be comfortable having that person have these unlimited executive powers, these authoritarian powers. Anybody want to say something else about that? Yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
So, like Blake said, like when you have, even if it's your favorite candidate that won, there's still the possibility that they can turn on you and not support you. So even though you might not be the original target of this disenfranchisement, you can be, because there's that opportunity for it to be you. I mean, we can really see this with this election this year. I mean, we have Trump supporters coming forward and saying that they're not supporting him anymore because of either broken promises or too extreme views or actions. And I think that can be applied overall, is it can happen to really anybody, even if it is your candidate, because once you give them the power to make those decisions, you don't matter anymore because your voice isn't needed to be heard. Their power isn't dependent on you anymore. And I think that just really contributes to more of a dictatorship than anything else. And I think it encourages populism, whether it's right wing or left wing, to rise, because if you're not for them, you're against them.
So I would kind of paraphrase that very good point that Ashley just made, that even in the most favorable scenario, you've got a candidate you just really agree with and that person can be elected. Even there, once that person is beyond the power of the electorate to either confirm or deny future office, then you can't rely on that person to be consistent. You can't rely on that individual to take policies which continue to be favorable. And Blake, you added to that, there may be other impulses, other incentives, other reasons why even that favorable leader, the leader that you think favorably of, why that person would take actions towards other groups, maybe on the basis of racism or nationalism or anti-immigrant sentiment and so forth, which weren't your original issues, but which, Blake, you were saying, essentially, we can see these are bad things, even if they're not directed at us. So those are a couple of reasons. I wonder if you ever heard this saying about democracy I think from the 19th century. You could find the quote very quickly: power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is that a saying that you've heard before? Josh, looks like you're kind of nodding.
Yeah, I've heard it before. It sounds very familiar, but I don't know where it's from.
Yeah, I don't know where it's from either. I see Rama and Elizabeth both saying they've heard it. It's easy to find. I don't remember it's a famous commentator from, I think, from the 19th century. But what do you think it means? I think it's relevant both to Ashley's comment and Blake's comment. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
I think this is something that I was kind of touching on in my response, that's saying that if you have like unlimited terms or unlimited power, it's pretty much inevitable that you're going to be corrupted in that way. I said like absolute power or like unlimited power is like a cause for tyranny in that way. So I think that's what that quote is getting at as well.
Excellent, excellent. So you already came to this connection, which I'm really appreciative of. In fact, maybe that's what made it come to my mind at the moment. Well, actually, let me collect more thoughts. Other thoughts that people have about what you might say is the most favorable case. The reason why we're kind of starting there, well, partly because Blake started there, but also because this is one of the criticisms of democracy, which is sometimes given. We really care about issues X, Y, and Z, but our politicians can't get us there very efficiently. We get gridlock in Washington, we get the opposition party blocking legislation in the Congress. We don't make a lot of progress. It would be good if we were more efficient. And how would we become more efficient? Well, we would give more powers to the executive, the president, give more executive powers of executive orders to the president. And in my scenario, essentially we've given the possibility of unlimited executive power. And why might that be appealing? I think both Ashley and Blake have given reasons to understand why we would be very suspicious of giving that power. But the reason why you might think it's a good idea, if this is a character like, I don't know, the most wonderful and admirable politician you can possibly think of, would Gandhi be that person? Who would be a politician you would have just complete and almost total trust in that you've ever heard of? Anybody think of such a politician? No, I see Ian. Ian, I think maybe you're a political realist and you're imagining that all of our leaders and potential leaders have their limitations. You want to explain that? Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess, the first thing about what you're asking now about the limitations, like I was shaking my head just because, there's, like, even if someone is great in like the public life and like the things they do are like genuinely good avocations, you never really like know. I guess I don't know how to really put it in words. It's just like Gandhi, like I'll use for example, like he like obviously was like is known for like an advocate of peace and things, but I've also read articles about him advocating for things that are really not okay, like that are like sexist and misogynist and those sort of things. Mm-hmm. So like say if we were to give someone like that with absolute power, it's like seems like a great idea for us because yeah, he's done great things, but once your power expands over everything and you have control of every aspect, those little, I'm not gonna, well, little in terms of like, can kind of show themselves a bit more and those less favorable aspects can be enforced.
Okay, good.
But I did want to say, so in my discussion post, I tried to do it like the absolute ideal, like I had full confidence that the elected authoritarian would do things like Medicare for all, like get good policies and would genuinely stick to them. Even then, if you don't have like the check of an opposing party, even if you fully believe in something, you could still be mistaken. You need, I guess, peer review to critique your stuff to refine it. Otherwise, it's too easy just to make a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Good. And remember when I think actually I made a mistake in what I asked you to read from John Stuart Mill, but when John Stuart Mill gives his justification of freedom of speech and expression, that's a central part of his argument, that we get a better understanding of complicated issues by having unrestricted discussion and articulation of beliefs and disagreement, and we improve through disagreement. But then, Ian, as you're describing, if there is an authoritarian single source of power, that person doesn't need to engage in discussion with anyone else because no one else has the power to block. Here's another thing to think about, though. Suppose we do have this really benign dictator. And by the way, Plato had a concept like this, the philosopher king idea that the wise individual who could see all of the interests of society and then make wise policies for all of society. That's sort of the best case for authoritarian dictatorship. But of course, there is no such thing, and Ian, you're kind of saying that. There is no such thing as a philosopher king who wisely understands all of the interests and all of the complexities of social life. And therefore, it's kind of a foolish idea to imagine, yes, authoritarianism would be okay if we could be sure that the dictator, the authoritarian ruler, were as wise as a philosopher king. Yeah, go ahead, Larissa.
Yeah, going off of what you just said, I don't think there's any one person that is wise enough to know what everyone is experiencing and everyone's truths. And like everyone in a democracy has different experiences, have different backgrounds, different beliefs, and different realities. And for example, like I'm just going to use the pandemic issue as one. Like I work in the hospital. I would love if everyone stays home right now because it's getting crazy. But for like a waitress or something like that, that's like a single mom, like she's not making any money because she's not waitressing, she's not getting the tips. So I understand from that point of view her issue there.
Mm-hmm.
But so like my perceivable common good, even though like to me, like I would side with people hunkering down and like everything closing. Like I understand the points of views where like people need to make money in order to survive.
Great. Are you, Larissa, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but could you make a connection between that point and some of the ideas that we got from John Rawls and his ideas of comprehensive conception of the good, pluralism, et cetera?
Yeah, so Rawls talks about the comprehensive conception of the good. So it takes into account everyone's beliefs and experiences and tries to pull out the things that everyone can agree upon the most. So that would be, you know, freedom of expression and caring for others and empathy. Even though people may have different like religions, different certain beliefs or lives, taking into account everything. The conception of the good is not really a stringent set of ideas. It's fluctuating all the time too. It's not consistent all the time.
Good. So you've got the structure of his view right. I think his terminology is a little bit different. So the comprehensive conception of the good, that's the very specific one that you have as a hospital worker with a certain conception of social harmony, a certain conception of how people ought to behave, how you personally ought to behave. That's called a comprehensive conception of the good. And that's yours and people who believe like you. But Blake maybe has more of a free market idea or some other idea. And so you and Blake may disagree at the level of, how much restriction on individual business activity should be created. But what you share, according to Rawls, is what he refers to as an overlapping conception of the good. An overlapping consensus is what he calls it. And you described it very well. So it's just terminology that I'm getting at. But what's really interesting about the pluralism view is that I think it relates also to the point that Ian was making, that it's in a big, a very populous society, a society with lots of different interests and the things that people care about, and different genders, different races, different national kind of cultures. The things that people care about are different in different communities. And the positive way of reading that is there is a kind of wisdom in those partial views. and that democracy can do a really good job of allowing us to learn from each other. If we are engaging, as Ian was suggesting, if we're engaging in real conversation with each other about the things that, if Larissa were able to have the conversation with the woman who works in a big boy, fat boy. What's the name of the restaurant? Big Boy? Is that what it's called? I always thought it was making fun of me, the fat boy restaurant, but it wasn't really. If Larissa could have the conversation with the single mom who is also a serving person in a restaurant, and now actually, Larissa, in what you said, you showed a lot of understanding of her situation, but the two of you through conversation would come to have a bigger picture of the overall complexity of the situation that we're in, as opposed to a very polarized view. I'm all right, and you are all wrong. Well, the idea of democratic engagement is that by articulating our different views of what's good for society, we're able to come to, in some ways, maybe a more moderate view, which isn't all one or all the other, and is actually a better view. It's a view that allows us to move forward better and more harmoniously. The point I was wanting to get at, Colin, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you about this. Suppose we've got the positive, I don't know, Bernie Sanders happened to be your favored choice, and he's still around. He's 110 in the year 2032, but he's the man. He's the one you wanted, and he's won the election, and he now has unlimited executive powers. He's got a real program, but he's finding that there's this pesky group of people who demonstrate outside the White House who believe in more, let's say, I don't know what the disagreement would be, maybe more protection of corporate profits. I think his program would be, we need to control corporate profits in order to do a better, more equitable job of serving the needs of the whole of society. And there's a small group of people who are just making an awful lot of noise outside the White House. And I don't just mean noise, but they're getting a lot of visibility and so forth. Bernie is unlimited in his, what he can do. What is the dangerous possibility? Colin, can you give that a little thought?
Yeah. So even though like some of us may agree with like that, principle of controlling corporate profits, him like attempting to limit the group that's speaking against his plan would probably be very dangerous for us in the future. I mean, he's an older politician. Who knows who would be in power after him? It could be someone, completely against something we all hold very true. So I think it would be important to still protect, something like freedom of speech, just in the case, that in the future, something that we all believed was in danger.
Okay, good. So that's a good principle. And anybody else see a danger that might complement Colin's point? He's sitting in the White House. He's getting more and more angry that they're kind of interfering, these critics, these stupid young people who are just getting in the way of his effort to reform things, and on top of that, they're very unruly outside the White House in Lafayette Park. What's the danger that you could imagine? Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
So what I'm thinking is he might take aggressive action towards those people outside the White House. What comes to mind is the picketers just before the First World War, advocating for women's voting rights. Mm-hmm. They were, charged with, I think, obstruction of traffic or, something that would, just try to eliminate their voice. And I think that's the situation that would occur in this case.
Okay, so there's the worrisome possibility that the unlimited president would use his executive power to use the power of the state to silence these protesters, whether it's 1917 or 18, the pro-suffrage protesters in Washington, D.C. I've got a great photograph of that march in the other course, the Four Trials course. Or if it's Lafayette Park only 6 months ago, when Black Lives Matter peaceful protesters were occupying Lafayette Park. And what did our president do? It's very scary what our president did within a constitutional democracy. We live in a constitutional democracy where people have a right to peaceful protest. But I think you probably know what was done. Anonymous, uniformed, but no insignia and no name badge federal police officers were deployed with major force to evict people out of Lafayette Park. It's very alarming to read the story of what happened in Lafayette Park. Very alarming, partly because we can kind of identify with our brothers and sisters who were peacefully protesting in Washington, D.C., but more scary in ways that we have been discussing now for 12, 13 weeks, using the power of the state to repress a group of individuals and partly a political movement which was disagreeable to the president. In other words, now let's get back to the 2032 election. Bernie is really irritated at these pro-corporate profit demonstrators outside the White House, and he basically says, this is unacceptable. Executive order number 3,426, no protesting outside the White House except in favor of policies which I am endorsing. And the park police will enforce this ruthlessly. And so what we get on the next day is truncheons, tear gas, pepper gas. There's some kind of weird secret weapon that was being considered for deployment in Lafayette Park. You'll think I'm being conspiratorial and QAnon, but no, it was in the Washington Post, not QAnon. But using a lot of force, and now the risk I'm hypothetically raising, Bernie, 110-year-old politician, really annoyed, really impatient, directs the coercive power of the state to repress people in the state. Now, let me ask you a question, which maybe probes your reading of newspapers. Does that sound familiar from any other country? Massive use of force against protesting crowds? Blake, I see you nodding. What are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of it's both Nazi Germany, World War II, and the USSR.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, those are good examples. In Turkey, there was massive use of force against critics of the Turkish president. In Belarus, I think you probably know about this, but there was a fake election in Belarus, and young people especially, but age mixed, were in the streets day after day. Massive force was used against them. Massive violent coercive force was used against them. In other words, we're kind of familiar with this impulse of dictators to use the power of the state to repress, threaten, and coerce critics. It doesn't happen very much in our tradition. And why is that? Why is it that if the mayor of a city, like the mayor of New York City is being harshly criticized for some of his policies, why doesn't he just send the New York police out and start truncheoning people, bludgeoning people, throwing hundreds of people in jail? What stands in the way?
They have a protected right to protest, like they're not doing anything wrong.
Exactly. So we have a constitution and a system of law which protects individuals' rights of protest, of expression, of criticism, even the right to be rude. Calling the mayor of New York or the governor of New York or the governor of any state calling them mean names. These are protected forms of speech in our country. And so we, on the whole, we have respected those institutional and constitutional limitations. In the scenario we're discussing, those protections don't exist because the legislation, the constitutional amendment that was passed, in my scenario, my prompt to you, in 2031, gave the president the power to override any constitutional provision that he didn't like. And this sounds like science fiction, but it's actually not science fiction because in other countries, it is a simple reality. Poland, for example, Poland's history in the last 5 years or so has been lots of coercion by the state, lots of coercion by the executive of the state against critics, lots of willingness to use violence against protesters and against critics. Many countries around the world, autocracies in which critics of the regime are tossed in jail, treated badly, tortured sometimes, subject to horrible, horrible conditions. And that's what tyranny is. How does tyranny maintain its power? Is there such a thing as soft tyranny, do you think? Gentle tyranny, caring tyranny?
I wouldn't say it's ever like gentle. I think it's more just like creeping, because it's like just the end goal is the same of just basically total control, and the like soft version is just an early phase of what that will be.
Mm-hmm. So okay, so that's an interesting point. The point that came to my mind as you were saying it is maybe not what you intended to express. Even a tyrant, there are limitations on the behavior even of a tyrant. Does public opinion have any role at all in a dictatorship? What do you think? Omar, you're kind of making that the point, so, or I'm attributing it to you.
Well, I think it has a small, like the dictator probably hears about it a little bit, because in order for them to remain in power, they have to have people to rule. And, revolutions happen all over the world. And if people are really that upset or really feeling that oppressed, then sorry, there goes the dictator. So they can rule with an iron fist, but they better make sure that they're not clamping too hard.
Mm-hmm. So really interesting to read is the history of Soviet regimes or Soviet-backed regimes in Eastern Europe between 1950 and 1992, basically. East Germany, for example, the communist dictatorship in East Germany, and Stasi. Who knows what the Stasi is? So the secret police of East Germany, most famous, well, partly for selective brutality, but even more famous for incredibly pervasive surveillance and intelligence gathering about everyone. So when the East German dictatorship fell in 1992 or 3 or whatever, the Stasi archives were taken by the successor government. And it turned out there were secret files by informers on just about everyone in the country. So Larissa, your lunch with Ashley, in which you discussed what a jerk Honecker is, that lunch, Ashley made a record of it and passed it on to her Stasi controller. And now, Larissa, you're in a little bit of hazard because there's a little bit of a knowledge, maybe you're a little bit of a dissident, and maybe you need more intensive surveillance, and therefore Ian, another of your friends, has been recruited. Agents have come to Ian and have said, Ian, you're not doing such a great job in your job. You work for the state, by the way. But if you can get close to Larissa and learn a little bit more about her thinking, that's what we need. And so what I'm describing was the system of social control that was used in East Germany. What's really interesting, though, is Omar's point. The East German dictatorship did not last forever. It did come to an end, and it came to an end in a very surprising way. Though it may be hard for you and your generation to kind of reproduce for yourself the shock which the world experienced when suddenly the Eastern European Soviet-style dictatorships suddenly collapsed. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia. Those dictatorships had been backed by the military force of the Soviet Union. Anybody happen to remember important points in Budapest and in Czechoslovakia in 1956, 1967 or 68, I guess, where Soviet tanks were deployed in Czechoslovakia, Hungary. In other words, public protest in Poland. Just reading the history of Poland during the Polish Soviet dictatorship, or Polish communist dictatorship. It's very interesting, but the question I asked Omar was, does a dictatorship have any interest in public opinion? And your answer is correct. Even a dictatorship needs some level of acceptance, some level of, might we call it legitimacy, some level of an ability to somehow keep at least the sullen consent of the big, the big percentage of the population. And in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and in East Germany, what occurred? Well, what occurred was that pretty courageous people, often young people, often students, by the way, created organizations, pro-democracy or pro-national identity organizations, which began to challenge the state. Solidarity movement, do you know about the solidarity movement in Poland? Is that a familiar concept to you? So the shipyards of Poland, one of the big industries was shipbuilding, and the shipyards had many thousands of workers, and unions in Soviet dictatorships were, they were state unions. They were controlled by the state. But an independent union called Solidarity, if I could speak, it's much more beautiful in Polish, except I don't speak Polish, Solidarność, I think it's called. And a man called Lech Walesa became a movement which became active in resisting and defying the authority of the Polish Communist Party. And what's really interesting is they were defeated several times. There were riots in Warsaw and Gdansk, Danzig, Gdansk, in other Polish cities, put down with great force. And yet the popular movement continued. So in other words, partly what I'm getting at is there are limits on dictatorship, but we don't want to go there. We don't want our country to go there. We don't want our, form of politics and economy to devolve to the point where there's a president with unlimited power, and then the best that individual citizens can do is join clandestine political groups and hope that nonviolent action in resistance to the state can eventually lead to fundamental reform. What is really interesting about it, I hope that it might be that you might come away from today's conversation by thinking, I'd like to learn a little more about how the Polish communist dictatorship fell, because it's almost like a great mystery. The power, the coercive power, the police power, the military power was all in the hands of the Communist Party. And yet the power of people, the power of the Solidarity movement, and also the power of the Catholic Church and the Solidarity movement were in league together. They were partners in this effort. They were able to exercise a different kind of power against the state, which in the end led to the collapse of the Polish communist dictatorship. It's a very interesting story. But coming back to our scenario, we've been talking about the favorable instance where the election has led to the Bernie that some of us think, yeah, he's got exactly the right policies. I would trust him. We've now seen through our conversation some reasons not to trust even the politician whose values seem closest to ours. Let's talk about the other scenario, the one where the opposition candidate is someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil, the populist, rough, bad-speaking. I don't know if you've read about Bolsonaro, but he's a COVID denier. He says Brazil will get through this without any precautions. We don't have to worry about this. It's a big conspiracy. He out-Trumps Trump in his disregard. He is said to have contracted the virus. I myself kind of wonder whether he actually did. I'm just not completely convinced that he did, but if he did, he got over it because he's in public again. He is perfectly willing to use the coercive power of the state. What is the coercive power? Well, it's the power to beat people, to beat protesters, to imprison his enemies, to use the military to repress other political powers, other political parties. He's willing to do all of those things in support of a nationalist, racist agenda. Okay, so he's the American Bolsonaro is the other candidate. And let's say that most of us don't care for that candidate. What's our feeling about the 1931 constitutional amendment? I'm sorry, 2031 constitutional amendment that gives the winner of this election the ability to override the Constitution? How do you feel about the Bolsonaro? Bolsonaro 2. His son has emigrated to Florida. He's run for president, and amazingly enough, looks like he's going to win November 3rd, 2032. How do you all feel?
I think it's a bad situation all around. Even if it was Bernie Sanders, it's just like it sets a precedent. Like, yeah, maybe I would be in favor of it in the short term, but in the long term, that could totally be abused by somebody like Bolsonaro. And it still is like too much power for one person to have, which is the completely opposite point of this country. So,
okay, so if I were paraphrasing that point into a single statement, it would be the institutional protections we have, which put limits on the power of the executive. Those are a much more important interest than any particular interest we might have in even a favorable presidential candidate. That having institutional, what did we call it during the election? It was called like guardrails, things which a president simply cannot do. Things like trying to overthrow all of the votes of the state of Pennsylvania and Michigan. Can't do those things. Well, apparently the guardrails held, though even today, that argument is being made by supporters of the president in the Michigan State House, that the Michigan legislature should override the presidential vote of the citizens of Michigan. But we do have institutional protections, and Omar, your comment, I'm paraphrasing as, those institutional protections are enormously important to us. Anybody? Yeah, go ahead, Ian. Yeah.
Well, this whole conversation reminds me, there's that saying like, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. I feel like no one would ascend to that type of power by being like, say, a morally upstanding, trustworthy person. Like you would need, especially with that amount of power online where you can then pardon anything you did to achieve that power, so it's of no consequence, that's almost an incentive to win at any cost, whether that means cheating or undermining elections or just, yeah, like there's no, I feel like, reason to play fair at that point, and then it's whoever is willing to be more dirty that would end up on top.
Sounds like you're talking about Richard Nixon. He was thought to be a pretty dirty politician, dirty in the sense that dirty tricks were his idea of good, clean politics. But right, so there's the idea that the incentives that the politician has, he or she may be putting forward a policy agenda, but actually it's power. It's a pursuit of power, and power at any cost, power without constraint, without moral constraint, without legal constraint, without institutional constraint. Yeah, alarming. So here's my, what do you think? Do you think we've sort of nailed it? That the reasons that we've mentioned pretty well establish, if you've got a democracy, strive like heck to maintain your democracy. Do you think we've sort of nailed that down? Or is there more that we ought to say about that subject? Yeah, go ahead, Blake.
I think, especially today, I think you read that statistic in the beginning of class, how a study was done 10 years ago saying 30% of millennials don't believe or don't see the value in democracy. I feel like a lot of people take that for granted. And I think that in terms of global politics, and in a position where democracy is just kind of the major states and world powers are democracies. And I feel like it's kind of taken for granted a little bit, but also I guess understandably so in a sense, because if it hasn't been working for lots and lots of people, then they can see how, that they want to change it. But I don't think a lot of people realize what the implications are if we were to not have a democracy. It's either you have a democracy or you descend into, authoritarian dictatorship. Or an oligarchy. There's really almost no in between.
It's a hugely important point, Blake. Ian, you were going to comment on that, I think.
Yeah, I think he's making a really good point. And especially with the, you said, it was the millennials, I think. We hear all these news articles about specifically that group of people really struggling to make ends meet and that sort of thing. And that goes with our discussion and reading about there needs to be economic stability as well. So I think overall there's a point where even if democracy is the most favorable option we have now, we shouldn't just say oh, that's the end. We should still be improving upon the system and not just become complacent.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great point. And I want to talk about that point in part of the rest of the time we have together today. What are the improvements we need to make in our democracy in order to be really sustainable and really strongly supported, perceived as legitimate by most of our population, and generating the kind of loyalty and commitment which we need to have in a democracy? So your point about reform is really important. The reason why I think Blake's point is so important is, and by the way, Blake, you said, you probably meant to say it correctly, you said 33% of millennials do not support democracy. It's actually the flip. 33% do support democracy. 2/3 do not think it's important to live in a democracy. Is that scary to you? I find that completely alarming. And I was talking to this very same daughter that I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, who is exactly in that age group and kind of came to political maturity in the early 2000s. And I was talking to her about what her friends might have thought. And one of the things I kind of realized through that conversation is the assumption might be, it's kind of the alternative to democracy is kind of like what we currently have, except not the negatives of existing democracy. So we just kind of continue and we express our opinions, but then we don't have gridlock, we don't have corrupt politicians, we get things done. So it's way better. Well, I think the conversation we've been having gives lots of reasons to believe that that would not be the outcome. The outcome is not pretty much status quo like today, where we just carry on our lives and we have our political opinions and we have our conversations with our friends and we demonstrate in, I don't know where people like to demonstrate in Dearborn or Detroit. Yeah, maybe down by the river. We have our various political activities, but we don't have the trappings of regular debate in the Congress. So what? Well, I think what we're kind of getting at today is, so what is huge, huge difference, huge loss. And really it's loss which leads us, Blake, I think it was you, I forget actually who made the point, maybe it was Josh, that we kind of have to think back to the early part of the 20th century, the rise of Nazism, for example. The Weimar Republic was a democracy, it was a republic. And the rise of Hitler was the rise of an anti-Semitic authoritarian party backed by armed goons, black shirts and brown shirt, paramilitary groups who beat their opponents, beat and assassinated the liberal Democrats, the socialists. So the rise of authoritarianism in Europe was horrific. And I guess what I'm kind of saying is that we shouldn't have I think I asked you a few minutes ago, is there such a thing as benign dictatorship? And I don't think anybody was willing to say, yeah, we could have a benign dictatorship that would be okay. I think that's maybe what those millennials, those hypothetical people were thinking when they thought democracy isn't so important. I'd be okay with a benign dictatorship that favored my values. Well, that's what can't be counted on. And I think we've been kind of exploring today the kind of predictable political evolution which would occur in a system in which we do not have checks and balances. We do not have constitutionally strongly established rights of freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom of expression, association, political activity, nonviolent demonstration. If we don't have those constitutional protections, then the devolution of our political lives and our social lives will begin to look a lot more like stuff that happened in Spain before World War II, in Germany and Italy. It's a dark picture to imagine. Okay, so there were two other topics I wanted to raise today. We've talked a fair amount about division, and the divisiveness of our country today. And we've also talked about racism and white supremacy and nationalism, these ideas which appear to be driving ideas in the populist political movements in both Europe and the United States. So I want to talk about the racism point, the ethnocentrism point, and to kind of focus on the question, what is required? What an important question. If we made no progress on any other topic in the course, but we made progress on this question, I would be so pleased. And here's the question. The question is, how can a harmonious, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multiracial democracy be created and sustained? A harmonious, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. How can we sustain? Because there might be the idea that a group which is a population, a big population that's divided by religion between Hindus and Muslims, for example, that's why we talked about India, or between Catholics and Protestants, or between Protestants and Jews in Germany, that someone might say it's just inherent. That's a fissionable reactive, dangerous combination, and it's just inevitable that great conflict and great hatred is going to emerge. So the question I'm putting in front of you is, how can we in the United States, we are a much more pluralistic population than almost any country in Europe, with racial diversity, national origin diversity, religious diversity. And in some ways, I believe we have done a good job in some parts of our country in figuring out how to make that plural identity really powerful and positive and growth enhancing for everyone who lives in that part of the country. In some ways, I think the United States, Michigan in particular, I think on the topic of Jewish, Muslim, Christian relations in Michigan, I think our state has done our part of the state, really, Southeast Michigan, has done a pretty darn good job of establishing a multi-religious, positive, democratic community together. The question I'm posing to you is, how can a democracy like the United States become stronger and stronger in its pluralistic form, not in its melting pot idea? If you want to be a citizen, then you've got to give up your Black identity, your Muslim identity, your Jewish identity. You must be just an American. Personally, I don't think that's a very attractive ideal for a multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy. But how do we avoid the fissioning possibility, the idea that one group will begin to have hatred and mistrust towards another group? That's my question for you. And I'm sure you have some thoughts, because actually some of you expressed those thoughts in the, I guess it was maybe it was a quiz question. I forget exactly where. Maybe it was last week. I did a whole bunch of grading in the last 2 or 3 days. So I'm full of your ideas, but some of you did raise this point about how a multi-religious community can be more harmonious. What do you think? Yeah, go ahead, Larissa.
I think it begins with the community itself. So the leaders of the community, whether it be religious leaders or like organization leaders, coming together and creating an environment that's supportive of everyone, maybe having like multi-religious events or multiple organizations meeting together and discussing issues. I think the example set by them first gives that whole community an example to strive for as well.
Mm-hmm. So the, what would you call it, sort of forward-looking, mutually respectful, tolerant, kind of cross-group embracing ideas of leaders, that can be a very positive kind of indication for a multicultural community. Is that a fair paraphrase of what you're saying?
Yeah.
Is it inevitable that leaders in a mixed community will have those attitudes, Larissa? What do you think?
I wouldn't say it's inevitable. I think it takes effort to go out of the way and make sure that people in the community that maybe smaller subsets of the community that may not have a larger voice, that their voices are heard as well. So I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but I think it's more likely that if you're close in proximity to a lot of different groups, that you're more likely to protect them, or if you're spaced out and like everyone around you is the same exactly as you, you may not think about it as much. So.
Okay. So one thing we saw in the case of India, Hindu-Muslim violence and hatred, is that there's a political premium which can be achieved by being anti-Muslim in India. That's what the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, has come to power on. It is its willingness to be the opposite of a tolerant, embracing party, And so you're right, Larissa. It's not at all inevitable that leaders will adopt this approach of an eagerness to reach across religious lines, racial lines, ethnic origin lines, and so forth. Not inevitable, but you are even more right about the fact that, or at least that's my perception, that when leaders in a community have that set of attitudes, they are able to create a much broader consensus across those various groups of mutual trust and a mutual understanding and a mutual reliance, really. One thing is, when I was the leader, the chancellor at Dearborn, one of the things which I came to realize was that I had formed relationships with lots of different organizations. The Latino organization in Detroit, racial justice organizations like New Detroit and the Urban League, Access, the Chaldean League, just lots of different organizations. And two things that I would observe to you. One is the leaders of each of those organizations that I mentioned to you, they had exactly they brought to their work the attitudes that Larissa was describing. They were in their work very interested in building bridges to the other communities and building understanding and partnerships to the other communities. And then secondly, what I came to realize at Dearborn is just, one institution among many, how important those friendships and those relationships were. If our campus had an issue of, tension over race or over the status of Arab American students or the status of Jewish students, it was always possible for me to reach out to Access, for example, or to the Anti-Discrimination League, and to find these are leaders who are willing to come and work with us and help support our students in a very pluralistic way. That's a clue. So I think we've got clue number one. How can a society do a better job of being a multi-religious, multiracial society? And it is leadership. So Larissa, good point. What kind of goes along with that? What else do you need besides leaders? What do leaders lead? Do they just lead populations or organizations? That's kind of what I'm kind of pointing towards. I think some of you know about Access as an organization. Who knows about Access? It's an organization I came to know very well ever since I came to Michigan in 2000. And one thing which I came to just have deep, deep respect for is the good values of that organization. It's pluralistic values that Larissa was referring to. That's partly about the leaders like Ismail Ahmed and now Hassan Jaber, but it's also about the kind of the rank and file attitudes and values which have been cultivated over decades here in Southeast Michigan. And that's a reservoir that we might call, what might we call it? Cultural capital or democratic capital, maybe? Democratic capital, I kind of like that. There's the idea of social capital that Robert Putnam, I referred to Robert Putnam in one of the paper topics. Robert Putnam is the political scientist originally from Michigan who wrote a book called Bowling Alone. I don't think I've referred to the book before, Bowling Alone, but it's his political science analysis of the fact that American society has had a decline in civic organizations. So things like, bowling leagues. I think that's the example that led to the title, Bowling Alone. We don't belong to bowling leagues anymore. If we want to bowl, we just go and bowl by ourselves. So what Robert Putnam refers to is it traces all the way back to Tocqueville and Tocqueville, Democracy in America. Tocqueville believed that Americans were joiners. We really engaged ourselves in civic associations of various kinds. And what Putnam documents is that there's been a decline of involvement in civic associations. Larissa's point is a very helpful one. In Southeast Michigan, there are lots of civic associations that individuals from various groups belong to, and sometimes those associations cut across religious lines or racial lines or other kinds of collective identity lines. And I feel that it's worth us considering whether one source of stable pluralism is the availability of associations which cut across the lines of religion or race or ethnicity or national origin. Whether those associations. Now that's an interesting point. It's an important point, because if we thought that was true, then we would also, if we favored democracy, if we favor a stable democracy in a state like Michigan or in a country like the United States, then we would also maybe give part of our effort towards helping to support and enhance and reactivate civic associations which cut across some of the divisions which we find in our country. I'm not talking primarily about the Trump versus Biden division or the Republican versus Democrat division, but the division of race, the division of religion, the division of ethnicity. Those divisions are, they're divisions which are kind of antithetical to a pluralistic democracy. We would like to have them not a source of conflict, but rather a source of enhanced learning. I'll give you a parenthesis about the University of Michigan Dearborn. Something which I always valued at Dearborn, and increasingly in the 18 years that I was chancellor, is that you as students were so open to the idea that you can learn from each other. That if you come from a Christian background, you can learn from Muslim fellow students, or if you are international born, you can learn from students who grew up in the Upper Peninsula, but they also can learn from you who grew up in Mumbai. The idea that there is a richness that comes from associating with individuals, people whose backgrounds were quite different from your own, that's a very different mental orientation from I am a Hindu and I hate all Muslims, or I am a Muslim and I fear all Hindus. It's an orientation of inclusiveness, which I think our campus is actually quite good at, has been quite good at, and hopefully we will continue to get even better at. We're coming close to the end, and I had yet a third question. I'll just put the third question in front of you. One of the things which I think we got out of Just and Jest is that populism isn't just about racism. It's not just about hatred of people different from myself. It's not just about intolerance. It's also stimulated by economic despair, a sense of being left out, a sense of being tossed aside. Partly, probably the most important part of that is material. I'm not sure that I can take care of my family because the factory in Youngstown has closed, and the most I can do is be an Uber driver, but nobody even wants Uber anymore. So I'm just really kind of stuck. So there's that part, but there's also the part about social respect. I think that also comes across in Jest, that when your economic position has been destroyed, then you also feel, maybe you feel like this country doesn't even respect me anymore. The people that I encounter on the street don't respect me anymore. I often pay attention to social conflict in China, which is maybe surprising to you. You might think there isn't any social conflict in China, but there is. And one incident I remember very clearly was a riot which occurred in a Chinese city when a porter, a man carrying a heavy burden, so he, in a very traditional way, he had, a stick and two heavy buckets on his shoulders. He was walking down a sidewalk, and an official and his wife were also on the sidewalk, and the porter brushed the wife with the stick, He didn't hurt her, he didn't hit her, he wasn't being careless. It was a crowded street. And the official flew into a rage, and he attacked the porter and he pushed him down in the street and he kicked him. And this created a riot because lots of people saw, what does this say? It says these officials think they're a different kind of person and they have no respect whatsoever for us ordinary Chinese people. Well, that impulse of respect and well-being, the porter also has a lifestyle. He probably lives on $200 per year. Think about that, $200 per capita per year. Can you imagine that? Living on, it's insane. No, of course we can't imagine. We can't even begin to imagine. We can't begin to imagine living on $200 per week. And this man probably lived for a year on $200. So absolute poverty on the one hand and absolute disrespect on the other. Well, the point I'm wanting to close with is, it's Ian's point. What kinds of reforms and changes are needed in our society in order to restore a sense of fair treatment for everyone, a sense of legitimacy? This is a society, as Rawls wants to think of, a just society, a society where everyone is being treated fairly and decently, and everyone, he doesn't use the word respect, but I think it's implicit in his theory of justice that we are equals. We are treated with respect, and respect is an important human quality. Well, if you live in Youngstown, or if you live in East London, and you're living in those circumstances of being kind of treated like human refuse, that doesn't express civic equality. It expresses the opposite of that. So we've got one more session, and I'm going to ask you something kind of stupid on my part. I'm toying with the idea of not asking you to do a white paper for next week, because I know you're finishing your papers. How many people would find that really helpful if you were relieved of the white paper? Okay, I thought you probably would be. So I'm going to drop the white paper. I'm going to drop the quiz, the quick questions, but I will keep the discussion. I would like to have a discussion question, but I will drop the other two assignments, and I'll send you a note to that effect. Great. Okay, well, I look forward to our last session next week, some good discussion, and I'm really looking forward to your papers. So great. Thanks. Have a good week. Bye-bye.